the bitter pill here is that ultimately, or maybe not, I won't say ultimately, but historically, the genes have been in charge every step of the way. That is to say, all of the stuff that we do above the gene level, all of the cultural stuff, all of the conscious stuff, has been in service of the genes. And that's unfortunate, but we are,
But no, there is a flaw in that. I thought
okay.
about that. Well, look, in human beings, increasingly, consciousness structures the mechanism that selects the genes.
Mm-hmm.
So here's an example. Let's say, I'll see if I can get this right. So imagine, for example, that you live in a hunter-gatherer troop, and you have a great hunter in your midst. And he's great for two reasons. One is that he can hunt, but the other reason is that he shares. And so that makes him a really great hunter. And so you elevate his status. Now you elevate his status. It's like you all vote, all the men vote. Here's the good guy. He's on top. Now the price you pay for that is a reduction, at least on one level, of your own biological fitness, because by elevating him up the hierarchy, you increase the probability that he's going to be chosen as a mate. Now, the benefit of that, however, is that you get to eat and you don't die. So, but my point here is that by that continual voting on what constitutes competence and the arrangement of those hierarchies, our conscious minds have structured the landscape that actually selects. So men vote on which men are likely to mate, and then the women compete for access to that victor. And so both men and women are behaving in a manner that privileges certain kinds of genetic manifestations. And so the consciousness is shaping the genes as much as the genes are shaping the consciousness.
The consciousness is in control of the behavior, but it is subservient to the objective of the genes. And unfortunately, I think the situation is that you've been handed a feeble toolkit by evolutionary biologists and are trying to make sense of the world as if it was higher quality than it is. So I don't want to drag you or our viewers too deeply into the weeds here. But my claim is that my field is divided between two camps that are incorrect. One camp are the kin selectionists, right? People who view this as narrowly genetic. These are my intellectual ancestors. And the other group are the group selectionists who have understood something else, which is that essentially altruism pays, and there are certain places you can stand that it appears that that is a driving evolutionary force, whereas mathematically it is very difficult to make a robust model of this sort, at least not a realistic one. My point would be the kin selectionists have understood one part of the logic correctly, but they've instantiated it too narrowly. The group selectionists have found a fiction, but just as we were describing 15 minutes ago, that fiction has actually given them license to explore a very fertile piece of evolutionary territory, which is the landscape of cultural evolution, right? Cultural evolution does not make a tremendous amount of sense through the narrowest kin-selected lens. It makes a great deal of sense through the group-selected lens, but the gateway is fictional. And so
I think you have to bring that down to earth more before I can completely follow what you're.
Yeah.
I'm going to harass you about critiquing my specific point after that. Anyway.
Okay, good.
But
so
I'm trying to follow, but I some examples would probably help me make sure I'm following you.
Let's take your example and let's put it into what I think the right way of resolving this conflict in evolutionary biology is. So I would argue that the right way of viewing this is something called lineage selection. Now, a lineage is an individual and all of that individual's descendants. Okay? And my point is that is actually a valid target of evolution. Lineages can evolve just the same way individuals can evolve. So we can see adaptation at the lineage level, which will look like, if you don't pay close enough attention to what you're looking at, it may look like group evolution. which is in part why the group selectionists have gotten themselves confused. But here's the point. Let's take your hunter-gatherer band and the case of the individual male who is an excellent hunter and is also valued by his male companions because he shares, and therefore his status in the group provides some increased likelihood of mating, which could be taken as an evolutionary loss from the point of view of his male competitors inside of his band, but I would argue isn't one. And the reason is this. Let's think about this band if everybody took a narrow view of their own contribution to the next generation, right? If all the males did was try to leave as many genes in the next generation as possible by whatever means necessary, right? That's a band full of conflict, right? Now, if we look across the larger landscape, all of the bands of hunter-gatherers, how much does the competition between two individuals within one band over mates affect how many copies of their genes are on that larger landscape? And the answer is almost not at all, right? That is to say, you can have 10 offspring to some other individual's 2, right? And you might think that you'd beaten them by a factor of 5. But there are 2 problems with this. One, if you are closely related to him, then a lot of what we narrowly in the kin-selected, the traditional kin-selected view, would regard as a loss to you is actually insignificant compared to the larger landscape. But the other thing is, if your band blinks out of existence 5 generations down the road, taking all of your great-great-great-great-grand offspring, right? If it takes all those people with him, then you have not succeeded. The advantage you got within one generation is completely erased by the loss of the population within which you were embedded. So the point is, if we really understood the mindset of the individual in rational evolutionary terms, we would understand that they, in some sense, will be built. They will be wired and programmed to behave in such a way both to advance their own genetic interests and to protect the long-term population well-being that allows those genes to circulate, right? They will effectively be protecting a gene pool. Now, the group selectionists will jump and they will say, aha, you've done it. You've said that groups are valid. And I will say, no, it is not the group. It is a lineage. It is the lineage protecting itself through the individual that is responsible for the adaptation here. You can dismiss it as a group, but that's like saying that I threw a frisbee.
What practical difference do you think that makes in relationship to what are the implications of that view compared to the implications of group selection viewpoint?
Well, they're subtly distinct, but I would argue in the end decisive. So, for example, if you take the group selection view and you do not recognize the game theoretic instability at its core, then you may struggle to find a formulation of Marxism, for example, that realizes the full benefits of human cooperation, not realizing that the structure you build will be inherently unstable and that you have to actually correct for that instability, which will either happen through brutality, which you don't want, right? Or you will have to architect something much closer to what Elinor Ostrom discovered in her Nobel Prize winning work about the way indigenous peoples do this very job. So I guess the point is the group selection, I would argue, is a temporary misunderstanding of lineage selection, but it does a good enough job to allow those who are involved in thinking in a group selected way to see human cultural evolution for what it is. And that's where the payoff comes. And so my point is we can now go back, having found human cultural evolution, which is where the heavy lifting is done, we can now go back and correct the group selected viewpoint, and we can make it rigorous by looking at it as a lineage phenomenon, not a group phenomenon. And we have then a continuous understanding, which then we've gotten super complicated here, and I wish we hadn't. But I will point out, though, that the upshot of this, from my perspective, is the genes have been in charge all along. They have acted through consciousness, they have acted through culture, but those things have been subordinate to genetic objectives. But now that we have consciousness, we can look at what it is that genes would have us do, and we can actually take them out of that control position. And we must, because they contain things like programs for genocide and warfare that we must sideline if we're going to survive. So, having arrived at an understanding of what we are actually built for, we now have to turn the tables on the genes, which is not easy, but I also don't think it's impossible.
Okay, so I'm going to branch out two ways there. I don't. There's no objections to the argument that you laid out come into my mind, and it's obviously something you've thought about a lot, and I can't spin up a hypothesis about lineage selection versus group selection sort of on the cuff. I would say, however, that it isn't clear to me how that argument, independent of its validity, is related to my original proposition that it's misleading in some sense to think of the genes more in charge than the consciousness. They're looping with one another because consciousness is in fact making choices about what constitutes those that will be elected to the status of more likely maters. And so that doesn't have any detrimental effect, as far as I'm concerned, on the idea of genetic. I'm not trying to devalue the power of genes across time at all, but if consciousness is selecting the mechanism that selects, then it's definitely altering the probability that genes are going to propagate across time. I would say your lineage argument, in some sense, actually likely makes that case more strongly, because look, one of the things I outlined in Beyond Order, I touched on it a little bit in the previous book, was the idea that, an action, you undertake an action to gain a particular goal in a particular framework of time. So all of your actions are bounded in space and time. You don't want it to take forever, and you don't want it to occupy everywhere, right? So you're operating locally, but you have to operate locally in a way, this is like the lineage idea, in a way that doesn't disturb your next local action or the one after that. You have to think about your action now, its consequences immediately, its consequences in a day, a week, a month, a year, and that shades off forever. And so an optimal action is one that takes you where you want to go now, but doesn't interfere with your ability to get to where you want to go in the future, or maybe even makes that easier. And so you could say we're sophisticated enough so that we not only look for patterns of behavior to admire that work now, but we look for patterns of behavior that work now in a way that isn't compromising the future. And that's why, for example, I think that we admire and track reciprocity. And that's obviously something you're interested in as someone who worked with Trivers. We track reciprocity unbelievably well. And I would say that's at least in part because reciprocity is a game that sustains itself across time. And that's actually a place where you can see our eye to the future operating. If I do you a favor and you don't return it, you're not trustworthy over the long run. I can't rely on you. And so I'm not going to afford you any benefits, evolutionarily or otherwise. So any flaws in that you see?
No, I would say that there's another rung to that ladder. So as an undergraduate, I worked with Trivers, and reciprocity was obviously a key feature of his contribution to the field. My graduate advisor, Dick Alexander, contributed the idea of indirect reciprocity, in which, typically mediated through things like reputation, it does not have to be repaid by the individual for whom you've done the service. And of course, this actually underlies the evolution of economic systems and the like. But I want to go back to the question you asked me about whether or not the genes are not, in fact, in some ways subject to the consciousness. There's a limited way in which that is true. Clearly, the genes are exists in an environment in which the consciousness has a great deal of say over what the genes get to do. But here's the problem. Let's take it away from people for a second so that we can see this clearly. The genes of a spider exist in all of the spider's cells, incapable of doing anything, exerting any force on the world whatsoever, except through the spider. So you might say that actually the body of the spider is in some ways in charge of the gene's well-being, and that's true. But if you had a group of spiders that woke up to the fact that their bodies were in fact in charge and that their genes couldn't force them to do anything, and those spiders decided instead of investing in spider ecology stuff, they were going to invest in spider hedonism, right? Something like that, so that the spiders were just doing what their bodies felt like doing and not what their genes wanted them doing, which is to spread those genes. Then those individual spiders would indeed be in control. They could do exactly what they wanted. But what would happen is those spiders that made that decision would fail to pass on their genes, and 2 spider generations later, they would be gone. And the
Right.
spiders that we...
Well, I would certainly, I'm thinking of a bidirectional effect, obviously. I mean, it's clear, I think you're absolutely right, that consciousness can make decisions that are going to put genetic evolution to a halt.
What I'm saying actually is that we must do that if we are to survive, but I believe it is the most difficult puzzle human beings have ever faced. We have to turn the tables on the genes, and we have to actually say, look, we have to confront the genes. The genes awarded us the most amazing computational machinery in the known universe. They also awarded us the ability to pursue and appreciate beauty, to be compassionate. They awarded us all of those things as a means to a narrow genetic end, a very uninteresting one. And the point is, now that we have consciousness and we do appreciate beauty and we can be compassionate and we appreciate people who have good characteristics, we have to look at what we're programmed for and say, actually, no, the machine is capable of something honorable, whereas the genetic objective is actually 100% identical to the genetic objective of every other creature with genes. That is to say, the capacity of a human being is spectacular. It is unrivaled. But the purpose of a human being is no different than the purpose of a liver fluke or an oak tree or a malaria particle. It's to pass on its genes. And given that we can now see that we don't want to be advancing our genetic interest, because frankly, that's not a defensible goal, but we do honor the things that our machine is capable of, we have to place those things at a higher position in the hierarchy. And the critical part, the difficult part, is we have to do that without giving an advantage to people who refused to give up the genetic program as their primary objective.
God, I feel like I'm caught in a modern incarnation of the arguments between Freud and Jung.
Is that right?
Yes, because
I'm not playing Freud's role.
Yes,
am I?
I think you are.
Oh, terrible!
It's not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. But what I hear is